The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility.
Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg.
Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m.
I'm not going to wait for anybody. Oh. Testing. Hello? Okay. Before we get started, I want to introduce Dave Richardson, who's kind of in charge of this building, so let's, amongst many, many other things. So,
good evening and welcome. Once again, Greece Central is excited to partner with the community to host events like this and sponsor the Greece Historical Society community event. So we're glad you're here, and we're happy to partner with Bill Sowers and the Greece Historical Society. If there's something that you belong to, another organization that you belong to, and sometimes you might be looking for meeting space or an area to gather, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to partner with the community because without your support, places and locations and buildings like this would not be possible. So I want to thank you for being here, and we look forward to the presentation tonight. Turn over to Bill.
and I'm Bill Sowers. I'm a current or lifetime president of the Greece Historical Society. And for anybody that's not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization here in Greece for over 50 years. And we own our own museum down on Long Pond Road, and we're pretty much completely supported by memberships. So if you're not a member, of course, we'd welcome your membership. But tonight, and by the way, next month, our next month's program is on WDKX, who is celebrating their 50th anniversary here in Rochester. So we'll hear about the history of this station in February. And that is going to be on the second Tuesday, I think, right? Yeah. Okay, tonight our speaker, Michael Leroy Oberg, he is the author of Native America, is a distinguished professor of history at SUNY-Geneseo, and the founder of the Geneseo Center for Local and Municipal History. He's published countless books, articles, and reviews, and has worked as a historical consultant for Native communities in New York and North Carolina, as well as for Indian Resources Section of the United States Department of Justice. He has won awards for his teaching and research in Montana and New York, including the SUNY-Geneseo Award for Excellence in Teaching. He is a native of Ventura, California. He earned his bachelor's and master's degree from the California State University in Long Beach, and a PhD from Syracuse University. From 94 to 98, he taught at Montana State University, before moving back to New York in 1998. And with the exception of a year spent at the University of Houston, he's been at SUNY-Geneseo ever since. He lives in Brighton with his family, and for those of you who know, we're working on a study of architect Thomas Boyd. He lives in a house designed by Thomas Boyd. So, welcome, Professor, and this microphone is yours.
Thanks. I've written some books, but they can be counted. It's definitely finite. When I teach, I put this map up on the screen for my students, and usually I just begin by asking them what it is. You know, what is this a map of? And what is it a map of? This is where you guys say, you know, you eagerly raise your hand and get the wrong answer or the right answer. What is it? New York State. Who said New York State? Why are you wrong?
Why wasn't New York State?
It looks like New York State. That's what the students usually say, right? But, okay, what is New York on this map?
Long-term.
Well, New York is This is 1770. This is a colonial map, the Tryon map. It's before the American Revolution, right? And if you look at this map, New York, it's the 5 boroughs which aren't even on the map. It's the Hudson and the Catskills. And the rest of this, you can see it there, right? It's the land of the Six Nations. It's Haudenosaunee land. It's the Iroquois land. And what one of the things I run through when I teach my courses is how all this land went from becoming Iroquois to New York. And it's not a nice story. It's not an edifying story. It's frankly not a story that any of us could be proud of. So it began with a treaty that was negotiated, or signed. It was negotiated over a couple of months, but it was signed on November 11th, 1794. It's the Treaty of Canandaigua. And in the Treaty of Canandaigua, the United States entered into an agreement with the Six Nations, with the Iroquois. The Iroquois promised that they would remain at peace with the United States. They would not join with Indians out in the Ohio country that were fighting against the United States and had wiped out 2 American armies. In return, they received, they got the return of some lands along the Niagara River that had been taken from them in an earlier treaty. They were guaranteed an annuity of $4,500 every year. And most important, and this phrase is used 3 times in that treaty. 3 times. The Six Nations were guaranteed the free use and enjoyment of their lands. The free use and enjoyment of their lands. And I want you to think about that phrase for a second. Before we get there, I want to jump back a little bit, because there's 2 principles, 2 sets of principles I think you ought to understand this process. And one of them rests in the American Constitution, in the history of American constitutionalism. And I would just throw this out as a question to you. I find that my students who come to Geneseo, they've never read the Constitution. They just haven't. It's just the way it is, right? So what does the Constitution say about Native Americans, about Indigenous peoples? What does it say? Nothing. Nothing? There's a reference in the Constitution to Indians not taxed, but that's just for calculating representation. And then there's this. Did that change? Because I got this thing up here on my screen here. I got to sign in. I'm just going to ignore it. There we go. There we go. So this is what we call the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, right? And it doesn't say Native Americans in it, but I think you can see from the highlighted letters how it's relevant. Right? Treaties are the supreme law of the land. Right? They trump the states, they oversee the states. So you've got the Supremacy Clause. We're going to deal with treaties a lot in this talk. And then you got this, right? Article 1, Section 8. The lawyers call it the Indian Commerce Clause. Article 1, Section 8. Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Okay? So we know what the Constitution says. Right? So that's one of the principles I want you to get at. Right? Because under this document, under the Constitution, just think about this. This language is really sparse. Right? I think when students do read the Constitution, they're really surprised by how brief it is and how few words there are in it. And what we know is that in the first federal Congress, beginning in 1789, started passing legislation to define various phrases. For example, the Judiciary Act of 1789 was passed by Congress to spell out the structure of the federal court system. Right? How many justices are on the Supreme Court? Right? It was originally 7. It was originally 7. The Constitution says nothing about it. You can have as many as you want. You could have 15. I'd be happy with that right now. Let's add a few, right? But you can add. It doesn't matter. It's not it's not sacred. Congress spelled that out. And with regard to this stuff in the Constitution, Congress passed a law in 1790 known as the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act. The Indian Trade and Intercourse Act, which first one was passed in 1790, and then it was revised periodically every year until 1834 when the last one was passed. But there's still the law of the land. And the Trade and Intercourse Acts are really interesting because they regulated not the activity of indigenous people, but white people, non-native people. Right? So if you wanted to go out and carry on trade with indigenous people, you had to get a license from the United States government. Right? Because Congress regulates the commerce with the Indian nations. If you wanted to purchase Indian land, and this is really important, if you wanted to purchase Indian land, the transaction had to be overseen by a federal agent, an appointee of the federal government, and the subsequent agreement had to be approved by the Senate, had to be ratified by the Senate with a 2/3 vote. Right? That's what happens with treaties. That's what the Trade and Intercourse Act does. And I want you just to think about this for a second. Because what power over Indian nations themselves are we, the people, giving to the national government? Nothing. Nothing. We don't claim any power. We don't exercise any power. Did we hope to have power? Sure. Did the United States want to dispossess them? Absolutely. But on their own land, the United States claimed no authority over that. All right? So that's one principle. Second principle comes from Haudenosaunee people, right? And you may have seen this wampum belt, right? It's known as the Turo, Gaswanta, right? And you have two dark bands on a background of white. And what this treaty means, or what this wampum belt represents, is an agreement that took place with the Dutch at an early point in the colonial period. And the two dark bands, parallel lines, right, represent a European ship and an Iroquoian canoe, right? They travel the same space, they course through the same waters, but the lines never cross. You don't interfere with us, we don't interfere for you. You don't make rules for us, we don't make rules for you, but we share the same space in peace. Okay, so this brings us back to Canandaigua in 1794, and you have two pictures of the two copies of the treaty that exist. The one on the left, this is the Seneca's copy of the treaty. It's housed at the Ontario County Historical Society in Canandaigua. You can see the original. It's brought out every November 11th on the anniversary of the treaty. The one on the right is the National Archives version of the treaty. And you can actually see that the ratification by the Senate is actually physically stitched onto the document. Right? So it's been ratified by the Senate, and then at the top, proclamation by the President, George Washington. That document, that little piece of parchment, is actually stitched on as well. Right? So that's how treaties work. Right? You have the agreement done in the field, the text of the treaty, the signatures, the marks of the people who make them. Then you have the Senate's ratification stitched on and the presidential proclamation stitched on. When you do that, you have a treaty. And I want you to think about this treaty, and for the purposes of the argument here, I know some friends at Tuscarora are watching this out in cyberspace, but for the purpose of the argument today, we'll focus on the Senecas, right, in Seneca land. And if you take this treaty, right, some of you have a piece of paper in front of you, and just if you have a piece of paper in front of you, just turn it over onto a blank side, if there's a blank side, or just imagine that you have a blank piece of paper in front of you, okay? That blank piece of paper represents all the land from the Geneseo westward to Lake Erie, the Niagara River, and Lake Ontario. Okay? Pretty good chunk of territory. We're in it right now. Right? In that vast tract of land, Senecas have the right to the free use and enjoyment of that land. The only power the United States has in that tract that's in front of you is what the Senecas have given them. That was a right to cut a road through, right, to the Niagara River, because in 1794, this is negotiated. The British still occupy Fort Niagara. The British still occupy Oswego. And they didn't leave after the Revolution. The Americans asked them to leave, and the British said, why don't you make us? And the Americans were like, we'll negotiate. Or we aren't going to do that. British were actually thinking of breaking off the Northwest Territory and creating a neutral Indian barrier state. That's a whole other story, right? But you got this vast tract of land where the Senecas have the right to the free use and enjoyment of it. Now we're going to jump ahead 3 years. September 15th, 1797, at a treaty called Big Tree. It's the Treaty of Big Tree, September 15th, 1797. The Senecas entered into an agreement with the United States. And to understand this agreement, we got to do a little background work here. Okay? So I'm going to kind of jump back in time, right? And the first thing you need to realize is just this chunk of New York that's up there. There's a disputed area. Massachusetts, of all things, claimed claimed Western New York. Just like Connecticut claimed a swath right across the top third of Pennsylvania. Right? That's bonkers, right? But both Massachusetts and Connecticut, they had colonial charters that specified a northern and southern boundary but no western boundary. So technically they could go all the way across the continents. You have these land disputes. Right? North Carolina, same thing. They claimed all the land in Mississippi. Georgia, too. All the way to the Mississippi. They have northern and southern boundaries but no western boundary. So Massachusetts and New York got to figure this out. Right? Because they both claim New York State. And they held an agreement, or a meeting, in Hartford, Connecticut. And New York and Massachusetts agreed that New York would get jurisdiction over the disputed lands, the right to govern it, and Massachusetts would get something called the right of preemption. I'm going to use all the props we have in this room. This is like a giant jungle gym for a teacher, right? And this looks like I'm squeezing a cat or something, but it's just preemption is the word, right? Massachusetts has the right of preemption. And what is the right of preemption? Preemption is the right to buy the land from the Indians. First purchase. Right? Now think about the logic of that. How can you claim that? All right, so listen, you got your phone right in front of you. Hold it up, right? And we all want it, right? We all want to buy it, right? But you can only sell it to me, right? So your phone is worth $1.
That's not right.
And work with me. Every one of you is going, everyone else is going, I'll pay $10 for that phone. I'll pay $5, $12, or $13. You're stuck with me. I'm the only one who can buy it. All the white people agree that I'm the only one who can buy it from you. So claiming this right of preemption, has the effect of diminishing the potential value of the land. Right? You see that? You're trying to sell your house now, right? It's a good market to sell a house in, and you hope for a bidding war when you sell a house. Right? You want competing buyers potential buyers to compete against each other and jack the price up. But if you can only sell it to one of them, there's no bidding war. Right? It's a bad situation. Especially when Massachusetts got on the idea that preemption rights are something you could sell. Because Massachusetts, as you know, is over there, right? So Massachusetts started selling the preemption rights to a series of land barons. There's this notion of like the little house on the prairie frontiers, people going out and carving the house out of the wilderness. No way. That is not New York. It is big business. It is rich dudes buying the land and then selling it to poor dudes, right? The first group that did it is Phelps and Gorham. They bought the preemption rights, and they did some business. They negotiated a treaty in 1788 or thereabouts that acquired some land to the east of the Geneseo. But their operation went belly up. So Massachusetts foreclosed and then sold the preemption rights to Robert Morris. Morris is one of the lesser-known founding fathers, but he was the financier of the Revolution, and the businessman for the Revolution, right? And Morris, he wanted to sell all this land on that, if you imagine that piece of paper in front of you, to the Holland Land Company. But the Holland Land Company wouldn't buy until Morris extinguished the Indians' right of occupancy. Right? The Indians, the preemption holders have the title to the land. That's the logic of the law, right? Indians have a right of occupancy under American law, which is a lesser type of right, but the Holland Land Company wanted Morris to get rid of that, to buy the land from the Indians. Then they could swoop in and start developing it, and start naming places like Batavia and things like that, and start making Holland in America. And ultimately, the Holland Land Company sold what they had left to the Ogden Land Company, right, which was a collection of prominent New York politicians and businessmen. So the Big Tree Treaty in 1797 was the Morrises' effort to acquire all the land on that big tract from the Geneseo westward. Okay? And that treaty was a disaster for indigenous peoples in some way. Right? What it did, and there's a Tuscarora reservation that ought to be on this map that's not shown, but what you have are a dozen Seneca reservations established by this treaty. The Treaty Council was overseen by Morris's son, Thomas Morris. It involved a lot of bribery, a lot of alcohol. And we know it involved bribery because Morris had receipts. He paid, never, folks, if you're going to engage in bribery, don't give people receipts for the bribes. Because if nothing else, we historians will find them. And Morris left a lot of receipts. He paid them into the 1820s. Right? So why would the Senecas do this? Why would they sell this land 3 years after they had negotiated a treaty at Canada where they gave them the free use and enjoyment of the land? Well, there's a couple thousand Senecas. You know how big this area is on that map, right? You know how vast it is. A couple thousand Senecas and tens of thousands of land-hungry ex-continental soldiers who want that soil. And they're going to take it no matter what. So you can sell it for something or just lose it outright to squatters. Right? And what they did was they kept certain areas, town sites, places they'd always settled, in return for the investment of $100,000 in bank stock. The earnings of that investment paid to them every year. So they turned some of that, they turned their land into an annual payment and kept these dozen separate important sites. But I want you to think about this treaty proceedings, what people said. And keep in mind, these treaty records, these documents telling us what people said, in this case they were kept by Morris and his interpreters, and they're all written down in English. So we're getting a very, very limited view of what happens here, right? We have what the American guys say to the Indians, and then we have Seneca responses written down in English. So a translator is listening to what these people say, thinking through the possible words that they could mean and writing them down in English. And this is what Thomas Morris, Robert Morris's son, told them, right? He's trying to tell them, look, sell your land. Selling your land's not that big a loss, right? If you look down at the second paragraph, right, the white people, they don't want your lands for hunting, but for cultivation. The Great Spirit has implanted in you a desire to pursue the beasts of the forest and in us to cultivate the soil. Morris knew Senecas and Haudenosaunee people in general farmed. Everyone knew that. They just ignored it, right? This cultivation, the white people farming the land, does neither diminish nor destroy the game. Your hunting grounds will be as of much advantage to you in the hands of the white people as in your own. lost my place. For you can reserve to yourselves the full and ample right of hunting over them forever. By selling your lands, therefore, brothers, and reserving to yourselves the perpetual right of hunting on it, then you retain every solid advantages for the comforts of life at which present produces you nothing. Okay? And then the actual treaty itself, the language of the treaty, the Big Tree Treaty. It lists all the land that's ceded and defines the reservations. But it explicitly reserves to the Senecas and their heirs the privilege of fishing and hunting on the said tract of land hereby intended to be conveyed. Okay, so let's take stock for a second here, right? You got that piece of paper in front of you. All right, you just pretend this table, right? This table is all that land from the Geneseo westward. And now you draw 12 circles on it. Those 12 circles are these Seneca reservations established by the Treaty of Big Tree. Okay? And in those circles, right, they're different colors, they're different sizes, but inside those circles, Senecas have exclusive authority to do whatever they want. They have the absolute right to the free use and enjoyment of their lands. And the United States can do nothing in those circles without their permission. The rest of this land, right? All this stuff in between, right? All that stuff. Absolutely now, white settlers can move in, they can plan towns, and they did, and you all know that, right? You've seen these towns. You see lines like 5 Mile Line Road and the surveyor's lines and all kinds of stuff like that. But do the Senecas still have rights in that ceded land? Absolutely. They have the right to hunt and fish forever. Okay? Now, you know, these reservations, you know, they're still... We know them, right? They're all meant, you know, these are pictures just from some of the Geneseo Valley reservations around, not far from where I teach. Squawky Hill, and sort of an overlook right at near the Mount Morris entrance to Letchworth State Park, Stahosco, the Gardo tract, which is the Mary Jemison's tract, the middle picture with no sign, with the dirt road in it. That's looking towards Little Beardstown, one of the most important towns along the Geneseo Valley. We have receipts, right? We have these Holland Land Company maps of these reservations, right? This is Squawky Hill, I believe, yeah, Squawky Hill. Gardo tract, that line going through there, that's the Geneseo going through what is today Letchworth, right? And there's actually a trail in Letchworth where you can kind of go down, close down to the river. That gets you down close to where the Gardo tract was centered. And then this Little Beardstown. Little Beardstown is, if you know Geneseo, it's just down the hill from the campus. It's a little bit south of the runway and the tarmac for the air show. Okay, so that's what we're talking about down there. Now, look, I want to take stock here for a second, because I think there's another concept that we ought to talk about. And that is, in Haudenosaunee culture, and there's exceptions to this, and I think it's overdrawn, but for understanding space, right, the world can be divided into woods and clearings. Woods and clearings, right? In the clearings, you have the towns, right? In the clearings, you can see the town right there, Little Beardstown. You see the houses are there, right? In the clearings, you have the fields, the cornfields. In the clearings, women are predominant, right? Women appoint the sachems who govern the community and lead the community. That's the clearings, right? And then you have the woods. And in the woods, men are predominant, right? In the woods, what do you do in the woods? You hunt and you fish, right? So let me just pose this question to you. because we've been reading treaty minutes, historians, written in English. So we really don't know what the Seneca speakers said, what those words meant to them. But if you have an English language document that tells these folks that they retain the right to hunt and fish in the woods, which is what you do in the woods, are you not recognizing their claim to those lands? A continuing claim to those lands. Well, let's jump ahead a little bit. I'm conscious of the time here, and I don't want to keep you too long. 1801. Seneca leader Red Jacket began to complain, and women began to complain as well. He's speaking for the women, right? That the white people, there's too many of them. There's more than we expected, and they are seated so thick over the country that the deer have almost fled from us, and we find ourselves obliged to pursue some other mode of getting our living, and are determined in all our villages to take to husbandry, and for this purpose we want to be helped. In other words, there are so many people here that you are interfering with our right to hunt and fish. You broke it, so we want you to help fix it. He's not saying we don't have the right to hunt and fish anymore. He's saying we need to diversify our subsistence. A lot of people have been saying that in these communities. We need plows, we need oxen, we need sawmills, you know, the stuff to go into sawmills, all kinds of stuff like that. Livestock, the whole 9 yards. You guys broke it. 1802. Some more sales. A strip of land along the Niagara River and Little Beard's Town in the Geneseo Valley. And just from the 1802 proceedings, you can see Seneca saying the same thing. We need the right to use the land. Right? We are reserving the privilege of using the beach to encamp on, the wood to make fires, together with the uninterrupted use of the river for the purpose of fishing, and likewise the privilege of passing the bridge and the turnpike when made, free from toll, and keeping a ferry service across the river. Right? There's another Haudenosaunee community, Grand River on the Canadian side. They insist on the right to cross that river toll-free. It's written into the treaties. Right? But you have these sales. The mile strip along the Niagara and Little Beard's Town, so you erase 2 of your circles. Right? So, 2 of those circles are gone. White people can move into those. And Indians can use them for hunting and fishing as well. Right? Okay. We'll jump ahead a few years, and there's a whole bunch of things we could talk about, right? In 1823, and it just gets so crazy ugly in some ways. Mary Jemison, a famous white woman of the Geneseo, she's the one that lives on the Gardo Reservation in what is Letchworth State Park. The Ogden Land Company wanted the Gardo Reservation. She's a Native American woman. She can't sell it. So what do you do if you're the Ogden Company? You're well connected. You got friends in the state legislature. You get a bill passed, and that bill makes Mary Jemison a citizen of the state of New York and a citizen of the United States. Now she can sell all the land she wants. Do you smell a rat? You should. And then you got 1826, and that's a bigger one. 1826, a treaty at Buffalo. Again, it was a corrupt treaty that Seneca signed because the U.S., the Ogden Company officials that negotiated with him said, if you don't sell us land now, you're going to go to Wisconsin or the Indian Territory or the West. You either sell or you get the hell out. They didn't have the power to do that, but the signatories didn't do that. They paid bribes to get others to sign. This person sitting here, his name is Charlie Abbott, and let's say Charlie Abbott doesn't sign the treaty. How much will I have to pay you to write Charlie Abbott on that piece of paper? $10, right? Yeah. SOL, bud. Yeah. Tough luck, man. You've lost.
I didn't sign that.
Yes, you did.
I
It
hate
is black
it
and
when this
white. Yeah. The treaty was sent to the Senate for ratification, and you need a 2/3 vote, right? That's what the Constitution says. So much what indigenous people are fighting for is for the United States just to follow its own rules. That's all. Senate voted 20-20 to ratify the treaty.
That's not 2/3.
That is not 2/3, right? It's not even close to 2/3. If the Vice President, John Calhoun, were there to cast a tie-breaking vote, it wouldn't have mattered, because it still wouldn't have been 2/3. And they said, well, this is a private real estate transaction between the Ogden Land Company and the Seneca Indians, therefore ratification is not needed. But it doesn't say that anywhere. You don't get just to make up the rules and change the Constitution on the fly. It was so corrupt that President John Quincy Adams sent an American commissioner to investigate the treaty, collect affidavits, collect testimony. And it was so clearly rotten. But in the end, they acquiesced in it. All of the Seneca's Geneseo Valley reservations were gone. So you can erase those circles. And the other reservations were reduced in area by about 1/3. So you're left with 4 circles left out of the 12 you had there. And those 4 remaining circles are smaller than they were before. I keep going with this stuff, but I need to kind of get to my big finish. Right? So I'm going to jump ahead, way ahead, a century ahead, to the 1940s. That means I'm going to go past the efforts of the state and the United States to drag children out of these communities off to boarding schools. And I'm going to move past the efforts of the state and national governments to try to divide up these reservations and allot the lands. In other words, destroy the community and give the land to individual landholders. Right? I mean, we're going to skip over all these efforts by the state of New York to skim the cream off of whatever prosperity comes to these communities. And we get to a bill passed by Congress in 1948 that the Senecas called the Spite Bill. The Spite Bill. Right. Senecas had engaged in some legal conflicts with people who had leased their lands, who had been delinquent, and the courts held that, in fact, these lessees have to pay their rent. So, essentially, New York's congressional delegation retaliated with a piece of legislation that in 1948 extended state criminal jurisdiction over Indian reservations of the state, and then in 1950, I don't have that up here, state civil jurisdiction over these reservations. But even in this bill, this is the beginning of a period that's known as termination. Right? You know, termination would last roughly from the end of World War II up until 1968 or 1970, depending on how you assess the actions of President Lyndon Johnson or President Nixon. But termination was a policy based on individualizing Indians, destroying tribal governments, and sort of ending the Indian problem once and for all. But even that piece of legislation, the Spite Bill, in 1948, recognizes these rights, right? That nothing contained in this act shall be construed to deprive any Indian tribe, band, or community, or members thereof, hunting and fishing rights as guaranteed them by agreement, treaty, or custom, nor require them to obtain state fish and game licenses for the exercise of such rights. Why should they be required to get a license to fish on land that they have the treaties guarantee them the right to fish on? Why should they seek the sanction and approval of the state that has no right to give that approval? Right? So you got that piece of paper, and you got those circles, that represent reservations. Today, there's the Buffalo Creek, the largest of them, is gone. It went away in 1838. You still got Allegheny, Cattaraugus, Tonawanda. There's the Tuscarora Reservation up by Lewiston, Lockport, Niagara Falls, that neck of the woods up there in the northwestern corner of the state. They have the right to the free use and enjoyment of those lands exclusively. But the rest of that vast territory, from the Genesee westward to Lake Erie and the Niagara River, they still have the right to hunt and fish. And again, if you put it in terms of woods and clearings, that right is significant. And this is where I want to finish, right, with a decision that the Supreme Court came down with just a couple of years ago. The opinion was written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, who was President Trump's first appointee to the court. And the case involved, it's a really horrific crime that a Creek Indian had committed in eastern Oklahoma. And we don't need to go into the details of that. But one of the questions before the court in that case is what happens to treaty rights over time? And Justice Gorsuch ruled for the court that treaty rights never go away through the passage of time. They don't erode, they don't subside, they don't become eclipsed. The mere passage of time in no way can remove those rights. The only way, he said, to remove those rights is Congress has to do something about it. Congress has to explicitly take those rights away. Congress has never done that. Ever. Right? So this is where the story becomes, less a historical problem and more a moral problem, I think. Right? New York became the Empire State through a systematic program of indigenous dispossession that at times violated, in black and white, the laws of the United States. It was not dispossession. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't natural. It was not manifest destiny. It was a crime in places against the laws of the United States. And friends, you and I, right? If we own land in this vast area, I do. Some of you do too, I'm sure. You and I, we're beneficiaries of a process of dispossession that was at times illegal, and even when it followed the letter of law, conducted in such a manner of conduct that it would repel people of conscience. It's for me. It's I've been teaching college history since 1994. It's been at this for a while, right? For me, it's no longer a question of whether they did it. It's not even a question of how they did it, because they left so many records. They left receipts. They documented it all. They provide the documents to understand what they did. We know how they did it. They lied. They threatened. They coerced. They got people drunk. They asked people to sign other people's names. They paid bribes. And sometimes they just took it. Right? Like the Bills Stadium. Right? It's coming back, that will kettle of fish, right? And that one stinks to high hell. So the question's not whether or how, but what are you going to do about it? And my students, they learn nothing about Indigenous people in high school. They learn about the removal of the Cherokee Indians from Georgia to the Indian Territory. They learn nothing about the removal of the Oneidas to Wisconsin. They may build a longhouse in 4th grade. And if you've got a 4th grader, I will consult. I'll make you a great one. All these kids with the cardboard and popsicle sticks. Man, use bark. Get it right. We will win. But, you know, they don't learn any of this. And I think a minimal first step is acknowledging that these rights to the land still remain, they still exist, and they need to be respected, even if that's painful for a lot of us. All right, so, want to talk about anything else? Or have any questions?
Yeah, questions or comments, could you give the microphone to whoever has so that anybody listening on
Yes.
live can...
Right.
So what can be done about it?
Yeah. Well, look.
What's feasible?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll take that back. Not because I want to take it away from you, but because I got some people online answer. Yeah, look, you know, I'm a history professor. I get to talk to 50 to 100 people a semester for, 45 hours or something like that. I get them for 45 hours, each one of them. And I think the first step is just to start talking about it. Look, there's been cases where Indian tribes have tried to get their land back. And in a part of doing that, they've bought land to reconstitute reservations from willing purchasers. Right? So you got your chunk of land that's adjacent to a reservation. You don't want to farm anymore or whatever. Sell it back to the tribe. Let the tribe buy it from you. Market price. No one's asking for a handout here. Even that. In 2005 Supreme Court case called Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation, in an opinion written by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ginsburg said, yeah, basically New York stole their land, bought their land in violation of the law. But it happened so long ago, there's no remedy. The remedy would be too disruptive. After all, in this case, Oneida and Madison County, Indigenous people are just 1% of the population in Oneida and Madison County. But she ignored, that's why it's the most horrible decision written by the court since 1978. She ignored the process through how that land went from 100% Oneida to 1% Oneida. And that wasn't even part of the equation. So even reasonable efforts by Indigenous nations to try to reconstitute things are met with opposition. A lot of that opposition comes from people who don't know the history. So, whoops. Don't move this fast anymore. But, no matter what I do or you do, there's 24 hours a day and there's 7 days a week, and there's limits to what we can do. And the one thing I can do is teach it, because they haven't heard it before, and it's not like there's a shortage of evidence. I hear a lot of people, I always hear people bad-mouthing students, like, oh, they can't read cursive, they don't read anymore. That's nonsense. It's all nonsense. They can read cursive. Just put a Coke can or a Dodgers jersey in front of them, they know what it says. Everyone does. It's hard to read cursive, but they can do it. They can do the work, and they get into it. It'll take time, but I think through education and action, that's one way to get there. I think the other thing would be to ask the Indigenous nations in the state, what ought to be done to set things right? A lot of places, they'll do a territorial acknowledgement before the gathering. We acknowledge that we are on the lands of, such and such people. And that's where they stop. It's just performative. Well, actually do something then. If you're going to acknowledge it, do something about it. Ask Indigenous people what they think the solution is. Let's talk. I don't think we can go wrong with that. And notice that can be a nebulous answer to your question. But, I'm a historian, I'm a history professor. I've got a limited skill set. and what I can do is make people aware of this. Yeah, anyone else? I'll just keep doing my laps here, right?
I don't know who the indigenous people are around me. How can I know that?
Well, this is Seneca territory, right?
It is. I grew up in the Cattaraugus Creek area, south of Buffalo.
Yeah, Cattaraugus is still a reservation, right? So you pass through Cattaraugus when you drive from like 90 from Buffalo to Fredonia. You pass through Cattaraugus. You see it along the interstate, right? The bridges. You're crossing right through it. Allegheny's farther south along the river, right? A big chunk of that reservation was flooded when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built the Kinzua Dam in Pennsylvania. It saved Pittsburgh from flooding, and it wiped out about, I think, a quarter of the Allegheny Reservation. I'm not sure. I could be wrong about that. But a good chunk of land.
And it brought rattlesnakes north. Because the rattlesnakes ended up on our land.
Yeah, I didn't know that, but that's... yeah, so the Army Corps of Engineers breaks lots of things, and that's one of them. But yeah, I think there are... Look, this Seneca's in a sense displaced other people, the Erie and Neutral Nation, Haudenosaunee people, but it's been recognized as Seneca land for a long, long time. Yeah, I mean, it's Aboriginal. And look, these indigenous nations, they are political communities that predate the United States. And that is the basis for their sovereignty under the Constitution and in U.S. law. Their own sense of sovereignty is reliant upon U.S. law, but that's where it comes in American law. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm one of the indigenous people. I'm Mohawk from Six Nations. And I didn't know whether I wanted to come and hear this story or not, but thank you for telling it, and I'm glad somebody's starting to tell it.
I should have said something about Six Nations, right? Because
Six Nations in Canada now.
Your community is a product of the revolution, in a way, of people who were... The Sullivan campaign came up and down the Geneseo Valley in 1779. The Continental Soldiers, again, the records are there, they drank toasts to the extirpation of the savages. They said it out loud, right? And those people fled, they fled to Buffalo Creek, Fort Niagara, and suffered through what was one of the worst winters on record there, dying in heaps. And others finally crossed the river to Grand River, reigniting a separate Haudenosaunee League there. And all Six Nations are there. There's Onondaga communities there. But it's a product of the revolution, of this campaign of dispossession. The revolution produced a massive diaspora, not just in New York, in Iroquois. It's throughout the 13 colonies. People were moved, right? We talk about the removal period under Andrew Jackson. Well, the history of indigenous people is a history of forced relocation. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Anyone else? Because it'll be really awkward me just standing here with a microphone. All right, folks. Charlie.
This is a great theory which I came up with about 10 minutes ago. It seems to me that God, this isn't a question, a problem. Is this a comment? Can I make a comment?
You already are.
Okay. It's a comment. The explosion of casinos seems to be, or could be interpreted as a way of giving Native communities something without having to take property away from people who have it now. It's sort of like, well, we're going to multiply all these set-asides, you know. We can't give you nothing, can't give you your land back, can't say, you know, not going to say, well, we're really sorry about what happened. But here's a set-aside, you can run a casino here, and, you know, guys don't even have to know how to do it. You just call in, you know, contractors to run your casino and you'll get a cut. Is there any plausibility to this observation?
Some nations, Onondaga, Tonawanda Senecas, they don't do gaming. They follow the Handsome Lake religion, and it's a sin explicitly mentioned and described in Handsome Lake's visions, right? So no, and gaming's a double-edged sword, right? Because the logic, right, is that no one gave tribes the right to gamble, have gambling opportunities. That's an inherent right. The Supreme Court held that the Congress can regulate it, but it doesn't bestow that right. So they regulate it. So to have the kind of lucrative gaming that I think most people associate with casinos, tribes are compelled to enter into an agreement with the state. And that can invite all kinds of problems. First of all, the state takes a cut, right? And then the state may ask for, and I don't know what, I honestly don't know what the compacts in New York say. But the state can ask for a cut. The state can ask for police powers, right? The state can ask for civil jurisdiction, like what happens if a casino goer slips and falls and gets injured, right? Who can handle that court case, right? There's all these kind of complications when you invite the state in.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. I can't say that. That went out on the internet. There could be children listening, right? But you know, so that's. I don't think that's the solution. But look, I mean, a long time ago, a friend of mine, he became president of the Seneca Nation. He told this story. It's a great story, and I'll wrap it up because I know the clock's running. And the Senecas, they have a number of gaming operations. They have one in Niagara Falls. They have one by the hockey rink, right, in Buffalo, and they have one in Salamanca, right? And they make some money. And for years there had been sort of, at one of the reservations, the Indian bus, he said. Like the school bus was run down, the heat didn't work, it was just a crappy operation. So they used casino money to buy their own bus. Basically enter into their own busing contract. To hire their own people as, you know, drivers and fleet mechanics and all the kind of stuff it takes to get a busing operation going, right? It takes some people, right? So, you know, you have to build things like this and all kinds of stuff like that. And so, gaming can provide seed money for other operations. It can provide money to fund language rehabilitation programs. But it shouldn't have to go to gaming, right? It shouldn't have to. They shouldn't have to cater to the state. I mean, I notice the state now gives out free fishing licenses to Haudenosaunee people, but they shouldn't even have to get licenses in the first place, in my view. And I'm just a historian reading 200 years of historical documents. So what the hell do I know? You know, just some chump who's read a lot of books. but it shouldn't have to be gaming, right? And I think this is again where we have dialogue. We ought to have dialogue and have a state government. And I think the one thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on is that they don't care about indigenous people. They will be fans of indigenous sovereignty to the point where it costs them something. And then that support goes away like that. Democrat, Republican, Pataki, Cuomo, Hochul, doesn't matter. So maybe with more information, people will do it. You know, get to it. Okay, all right. I'll finish up.
I always hope that when we have one of these programs, you can go away and say, I learned something. So I think I certainly did today.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you for coming tonight. Next month is, like I said, the history of WDKX. Our March program is, and I can't think of his name, from the Museum and Science Center. It's going to talk about the eclipse coming, and we're right in path. So, okay, everybody. Thank you. Men's room, by the way, just in case you need the restrooms, you're right outside the door. That's a different group, but it's the same people. Oh, it is? Okay. And then Thursday night, first Thursday, 2 o'clock.
Upcoming second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society. Coming in February 13th at 7 p.m. will be the history of WDKX. Times, dates, and locations for the following programs are subject to change. Please check our Facebook page for updated information.
Want to learn more from the Greece Historical Society and Museum? Then click that subscribe button. Hit that bell icon to get notified when there's new content coming from the Greece Historical Society. You can visit us on the web at GreeceHistoricalSociety.org. You can find us on Facebook at Greece Historical Society. And you can stop in at the Greece Historical Society at 595 Long Pond Road.